Kia ora tātou. I'm Adrian Meredith. I was born in Christchurch and I'm Canterbury and loved North Canterbury, but I spent maybe the first 15 years of my career up in the Waikato. Whereas I'm here supposedly talking about braided river aquatic ecology, trends past, present and future, that's a difficult subject because these are big rivers. To be a fisheries scientist up there, and we did some very detailed fisheries surveys for a number of years on the Waikato River. A real challenge, a real privilege. And that sort of work has continued up there in detail. And even to today, with it being managed by the Waikato River Authority, which is a very effective sort of co-governing sort of body for the big water body up there. You know, maybe that's a challenge for the future. But this subject, braided river aquatic ecology, past, present and future, is an interesting subject because it tends to indicate that we're doing lots of monitoring. Now, the summary of my talk today is that this is an important but difficult challenge to answer because we understand, and I'll cover over these 5 points through my presentation, but I'll tell you them to begin with. We understand the important wet features of braided rivers, and I distinctly state that as that BRaid is a really important symposium. I've been coming to it for a number of years, and Nick, you mentioned it's been going 17 years, and great work being done. But the feature of BRaid has been largely braided river birds, and in many respects a terrestrial emphasis of the dry parts of the river. I've come on here a number of times to talk about the wet features of the river because they really do have to be integrated together if we're really going to give effect to managing these really special places. So we understand the important wet features of the river, and there's been some really great reports out there, but there's really an absence of regular quantitative monitoring of our braided rivers or the wet parts of them, really because it's too big and too difficult. And I mentioned the Waikato River earlier because there was a lot of resources up there and we actually rose to the challenge up there, but the resources really haven't been down here for the braided rivers to the same extent. The evidence we do have is often qualitative, and that's macroinvertebrate surveys, the NCIs, and seeing what the insects will tell us, but it really doesn't often give us a production sort of estimate. And I understand, and Colin, you mentioned earlier that one of the features that is maintaining the flows and the productivity of our rivers, and that's an important feature here because our braided rivers are still the energy pathway that's feeding everything, and it's really important. We've essentially got a load of one-off surveys, and I'll deal with a few of those. And most of those were back in about the 1980s, as another parallel with some of the work you covered, Colin, in your history. Snapshot surveys have been often repeated, often 40 years apart, and that often gives us our past and presence. It's a frustration, it's what we're having to cling to, but often it's all we've got to actually talk about trends in our braided rivers. But they give us a snapshot of the rivers, and there's a large number of really important theses being completed on many of our braided rivers, and they're a ripe opportunity to come back and compare them, and I'll give you one or two examples of that. And then finally, there's narrative or anecdotal descriptions, often from the structured surveys. Again, the one that Rasmus mentioned that Don Jellyman did for ECAN recently, that give us a sort of further clear illustrations of the pathway we've been on from the past to the present. So none of these are definitive, but they give a compelling balance of evidence of degradation. And then I'll finish this presentation today by how do we influence the future and figure out where we're going to in the future. So is that monitoring, or is it action, or is it both? And that's where I'll finish. I'll work through that. Long-term monitoring. There's been no long-term fish monitoring of our big braided rivers, or largely, other than the Waikato, most of our big rivers of New Zealand. Many councils are considering or trialling fish monitoring, but methods are generally been only developed and set for the small wadable rivers, and that's where most of the effort is put at the moment. At ECAN, we're still scoping a fisheries monitoring program, but it's not started yet, and it's likely to be on the smaller rivers and the braided, and so therefore for the braided rivers it's unlikely. That's unfortunate, but that's probably the reality of where we're going, and it's why we've got to rely on other sources of information. Macroinvertebrates, are generally qualitative or very descriptive. So we're not looking at the actual true quantity or production of them. It's more a description of the quality or the health of our waterways from what's living in them. And once again, they're wadable methods. So there's very little of that conducted in our braided rivers. Now, the Niwa National Rivers Water Quality Network was very far-reaching. It established in 1989, went through to 2020 when largely Niwa pulled back out of it. And it did have some large braided rivers, large and medium-sized braided rivers, the Waitaki, the Opahi, the Waimakariri, and the Haranui. And whereas MCI and QMCI indices might not tell us much from that, in that they've stayed somewhat the same, there's probably some work going to come out. If there's more, I understand there's some work going on with some of that long trainers, that there are some issues there, and particularly some of their large stoneflies, some of the plecopterans are increasingly being seen to be missing. And maybe they're some of the bigger food sources in illustrating that some of the food chains have been changing in our big braided rivers. But it's quite limited. At ECAN, our Aquatic Ecosystem Health Program, once again, it's been running for just over 20 years, from 2000 to the present, but it's largely focused on wadable rivers, not braided rivers. Ecologically, we also have our periphyton programs. They're more recent, once again, mostly on wadable methods. Habitat assessments, another really important feature as we try to bring all the ecological characteristics together. It's relatively recent, and once again, mostly wadable methods. And so we're developing really good information on our smaller streams and rivers in these senses, but braided rivers tend to miss out because they're quite difficult to get into. And I'd say what else? So I'll start here, one-off surveys of a couple of pictures off the side there that probably clutter up people's bookshelves. You know, the catchment boards produced these 3 and 4 and 5 volume tomes many years ago of the resource surveys of, say, the Waimakariri and the Rakaia and the Rangitata and things like that. There was also the Marine Department or New Zealand Freshwater Fisheries Research Reports, the green books that you'll often see through the 1980s and the 1990s. And these represent our best assessment of the past in terms of our braided rivers, the ecology, whether it be the fisheries or the ecosystem health or habitats. But they're still often rolled out as still the most comprehensive surveys and the starting point of a discussion of the health of our rivers. But they often predate the pressures, and they predate most of the recent developments that have put a lot of pressure on our rivers. We then resort to snapshots. And given that information back in the 1980s was the standard, there has been some efforts to repeat that work back in sort of 35 to 40 years later in recent years. The first one, the Rakatata or Rangitata, Marty Burnett wrote a report back from in 1983, on data from 1983-84 on the fish and benthic invertebrate populations of the Rangitata River. This was repeated by Niwa staff, Sinton and Jellyman, looking at the years 2018, 2019, and it was update on the fish and benthic populations of the Rangitata River. This was paid for by the Department of Conservation, produced for them with the Rangitata being one of their priority national rivers. And this report here basically had a number of bullet points. It said that it identified a reduced number and abundance of estuarine species, that is, reduced number and abundance of giant bully, common smelt, stocal smelt, inanga, black flounder. In other words, a lot of the native fish were just not as abundant or present as they previously were. A lack of diadromous galaxids, which is the migratory galaxids, often koaro and inanga. Reduced numbers of non-diadromous galaxids, that's the Canterbury galaxids and the ones that do not migrate. A large reduction in the longfin eels, which and of the 2 eel species in New Zealand, they're the riverine species that you'd normally expect to be in rivers like the large braided rivers. And a reduction in the salmon and trout, as Rasmus has told us this morning. There was some corresponding positives. It found that torrent fish and bluegill bully and common bully were still abundant, but generally it's describing degradation of fish communities. Now, I'd be hesitant at saying this is a trend, because two points over 40 years doesn't make a trend, it's a comparison. And anyone could say which of those years was potentially a good year or a bad year, but it does give us a steer, and it's quite important information, which is why the Department of Conservation commissioned this report. Maybe another snapshot is the Rakaia River. Eldon and Gregor in 1983 produced a report, Fishes of the Rakaia Lagoon, and my colleagues, Jared Arthur and Duncan Gray, did some sterling work with a number of other agencies, many people maybe in the audience here that helped them. Very hard work looking at the fish communities of those river mouths of that river to repeat that work. And once again, this was written up in these two papers, and it found once again, much fewer stocal smelt, fewer inunga and salmonids, smelt numbers substantially decreased, a substantial decrease in black flounder and longfin eels. And so once again, the native fisheries decreasing dramatically, and in particular, many of our mahinga kai species as well, sort of on a very perilous decline there as well. There was issues of more yellow-eyed mullet were present in that lagoon, more common bully were in that lagoon, and probably that's illustrating that the habitat has changed. In other words, you're losing the sensitive species that are not coping with that degradation, but you're getting yellow-eyed mullet and maybe bullies that are more tolerant of that degradation of habitat doing well. Further information that we can sort of tease together to build a story here of what's the state of our braided river fisheries is fishery declines. There's been a substantial decrease in recruitment of albers, particularly of the longfin eels from a number of NIWA and Fisheries New Zealand surveys, and work like the glass eel surveys that the Department of Conservation has been doing on a couple of rivers. And it's concerning that even that work is coming to a halt as well. There's a low abundance of adult longfin eels, such that Fisheries New Zealand doesn't allow a significant quota for them in the South Island now. The smelt fishery has come under a lot of scrutiny. It's particularly lost. Many years ago, there was descriptions of tons of smelt being initially harvested from the Ashburton River, Hapua. Those sort of numbers just don't exist today. The black flounder fishery, not so long ago, was an important fishery at most river mouths in Canterbury. And all of these studies are finding that they're quite hard to get now. They're just not surviving there very well. And of course, we've got the salmon and sea run trout greatly decreased that Rasmus told us again. Finally, I put down there the kanakana or the lamprey, are very rare. And certainly when I came back to Canterbury 28 years ago, I spent quite a lot of time with Kelly Tamari Davis, who was very passionate about the kanakana or lamprey fishery, particularly of his cherished Waiho River down south. And, they're very hard to even, many people have never even seen one nowadays, so that's another fishery that's decreased. The whitebait fishery has maintained, and it's for balance. People are still catching some years considerable amount of whitebait. And the mullet are doing much better in many of our river mouths. And even in the last 2 or 3 years, we're seeing large amounts of kawai increasing at the river mouths. And once again, I'd say what we're seeing there is the tolerant species are still doing okay. The sensitive species are in decline. I'll touch on many university theses give us some information, because many of these are on river communities. There's too many to list, but I'll just grab one from early in my career. A colleague of mine, Gary Scrimmager, was working on torrent fish and bluegill bullies in the Ashley Ruakahuri River. And it was a key study that published really well on the breeding and the biology and the feeding of these two, previous to that, poorly known species in New Zealand. They're abundant, and they were very abundant at the Rangiora sites in the Ashley River. Their abundance in the Rangiora study sites is now very low. And sort of it's another one that's illustrating a degradation pattern and begging the question of why. And therefore, there may be a lot more information to be gleaned from re-examining thesis studies on braided rivers. Another fruitful avenue to look at when we don't have continuous monitoring programs that otherwise provide us that information. The final one is narratives and community surveys. Rasmus mentioned Don Jellyman's report on perceptions of change, recording observations over several decades at Canterbury River Hapua, and ECAN had commissioned this work. And it identified, once again, a number of different declines in stocal smelt, sea run brown trout, etc., and also gave some clear indications that flow was the indications of the problem were a lack of flow in the rivers, siltation of the river mouths and the hapua, and algae growing there, etc. Also, loss of Mahinekai species abundance of many rivers is also really important, particularly around the area of marae, kainga, nohanga sites. Often descriptions of an inability to provide much more than a taste nowadays compared to what used to be a feed or even a larger feed. So this is all evident. Is this evidence of degradation or decline? No one source of evidence is definitive alone, but together all these examples give quite a consistent degradation message. So I think it's compelling that it's a balance of evidence or an accumulation of evidence that indicates this decline. So this is the past to present story, and this is my story of spending 40 years working on these rivers through to now. What of the future? Is this the next 40 years? How do we set up and manage to report the future in 30 or 40 years' time? Do we simply need to address and actually bite the bullet and put monitoring programs in place? It's very resource intensive, very difficult in large braided rivers, and therefore we end up with snapshots rather than regular monitoring. And I'm mindful that I have this conversation with people. If you're monitoring things enough, do they get better? No, they don't. So given the strong signal of degradation, we need actions to reverse and improve these values. So the causes of braided river declines, there's many there. I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but they start with flow and allocation. We've allocated a terrific amount of water out of our big braided rivers. Rasmus mentioned it. Colin O'Donnell mentioned it. We've got to acknowledge that. Water quality, river geomorphology, a whole bunch of that you could add to it. That's the problem. What we've got to do is start addressing some of those. How do we step up to manage and report the future? We need to identify and prioritise those pressures. And I know, just briefly touch on here, our Land and Waters Challenge produced this great report last year designing freshwater monitoring programs to detect early improvement. And it was saying, rather than just monitoring state of the environment, we need to be monitoring actions and interventions. And that's our future. I'll just finish with, sorry, Sonny, I'll just finish with this slide because as of Monday, Environment Canterbury has started a new journey with its RPS and its planning process entitled What's Our Future Canterbury? And as of Monday, we're going out to the entire community of Canterbury, including all of you, to say, tell us what the future is, tell us what the vision is. We need to talk about our future. And I think a lot of what we're hearing today and what I've talked about today is really in this space. Do involve yourself in this process. Do spend some time thinking, what is your vision for Canterbury? What do we need to change? What do we need to address? And involve yourself in this process. Thank you.